Ateneo 2, no position 311, and motion for House self-law victims that is the use of capital punishment and sentencing, etc. etc. Good luck to both teams, and it is a great pleasure to let the first speaker, Prime Minister, start the debate.
The state can never pretend to know what is best for its people. Government side believes in three basic principles. Firstly, within that retribution, especially for victims and the families of a victim, is especially subjective. And it says that nobody can ever say what is retribution for a person. Nobody can ever say what is true closure for a person. And that's important because when you're talking about extreme crimes such as death penalty, extreme crimes that contribute to death penalties, such as murder and rape and all those other things, we have to consider these factors on what is best to make sure that these individuals can get past these kinds of crimes, right? Can get past that their family member was murdered, can get past that they were raped. Second, we think that the death penalty is such a different crime from any other, or rather such a different punishment from other, because it has the greatest impact or the greatest loss at all, the cost of a life. You can never repair or can never get back a life once you take it away. So we think that especially in these scenarios that even consider death penalty, right? Cases such as rape and murder, which are so extreme and so drastic, we need to make sure that we have this consideration in place. Because it's not like any other punishment where you can go away to your home after you're done sentencing, right? You will die and you will never be able to go back again. Thirdly, we think that we need to realize and be realistic that the state is not omniscient, right? It can never pretend to tell us what is best for its people, and it can never tell us what it thinks is the best for its citizens, because it knows that there is no set stone morality and etc. Sit down. What is our proposition coming from government side? Three things. Firstly, in places where death penalty is already legalized, and for example, a person is considered for a death penalty, we will in fact ask the victim or the direct family of that victim whether they want the death penalty to continue or not. If they say that they do not want the death penalty, then they will in fact incur a life sentence in prison. They will stay in prison, and that's where they're going to live their life. Secondly, we're perfectly fine with other means of saying whether you want other standards of saying whether you want death penalty or not, specifically ethics or morals. Why? We believe that, for example, if you're an atheist, we need to realize that the root of your religion or the root of anything is your morals. And if you don't have a religion, then you'll have your morals to guide you. And we believe this is still a fair standard to judge on whether you want to kill a person or rather you want somebody to go through the death penalty or not. Sit down. Thirdly, we think that, for example, even if in 5 years after the crime happened, right, or 5 years after the initial crime happened, and you are in fact in prison, we think that the victim and the victim's family can in fact still decide to say that maybe I want the death penalty now. Maybe I had a change in morality. Maybe I have a change in beliefs. That's something that's perfectly acceptable for us. Sit down. We think that this debate is judged upon two basic things. Firstly, where do we best get retribution, especially with the victim and the family of the victim? And secondly, is this something that we can even do instead of status quo? Let's get on to the first idea that you want to bring up. Yes?
If you do the retribution subjective, you also allow victims or victim family victims to extend the perpetrator to extend it and increase the level of that punishment.
We already told you that when you're already considering death penalty, it's only two options: either death penalty or life sentence in prison, right? We don't think that it's that hard. We think that when you're considering these crimes already, within these things are perfectly acceptable. Let's go back. We think that we can never, as a state, say what is right or what is wrong. Or rather, we cannot not always say for each person what is going to give me the best closure or not the best closure. Why? Because the state can't simply pretend to know what is best for each and every individual, because each and every individual has a different set of morals or not. For example, maybe a Christian believes that using a condom is a bad idea, or maybe using a condom is a good idea, right? Even if you are in fact set as a Christian, you still have different set of values, right? Or even if you're atheist or an agnostic, or no matter whatever your religion is or moral is, you still have different sets of values. Simply put, morality is not set in stone. But why is this especially important when you're dealing with matters that even consider the death penalty? Because we need to realize what even incurs the death penalty, right? Or what even incurs people getting the death penalty from the state. It's cases such as murder, of rape, of extreme torture, right? And these are the extreme cases that will in fact impact the lives of individuals no matter what, right? These will traumatize you or your family. You can never escape these harms. You'll never be able to get away from them unless you get that closure from you, right? Unless you get that retribution from your life. Because if you cannot get away from that rape, if you cannot get away from that murder, you'll never be able to function properly in society. And we think that it's perfectly fine for you to judge what is in fact that retribution, right? Maybe it's against your morals to say that somebody dies, but I still want him to go to prison. That's something that we want to believe in. But why is retribution such a value coming from government side? It's very simple. We think that if you cannot get that closure, you will simply not be able to function properly in society. If you remember that you were raped, and if you remember that you were raped, or your victims or your family was murdered, you'll never be able to get past that. And that's such a harm, because obviously the state wants you to be able to function in society, right? It does not want you to keep on remembering that traumatizing experience. It does not want you to keep on remembering that, hey, my family was murdered, or my cousin was murdered, right? But why is the golden standard for us religion, right? Why is our standard, especially religion, or your morality, especially in our case? Sit down. We think that the religion or your morality is the core of a person, in the sense that if you believe in this X or Y values, or if you believe in this sense of morality, that's how you define yourself. That if you go against that morality, then you will be crushed. For example, we think that right now, for example, if you're given a conservative family, right, and maybe a child of that conservative family is murdered, right? If that abuser or if that murderer goes to the death penalty, that conservative family would think that they're murderers themselves, because they're so heavily Christian, and they believe that any kind of murder and any kind of harm against that abuser is in fact something that will make me go to hell. That's something that we have to consider, because if that's going to impact that family, and if it's going to impact the whole lives of those individuals, that's something that we cannot accept. But even in status quo, we already see that the state does in fact consider what people value, right? For example, if a Jehovah's Witness can in fact refuse a blood transfusion in the status quo if it's just because they believe it's against their beliefs, right? They can basically say that they can commit suicide and not get a blood transfusion that will save their lives because it's so heavily against what they believe in. What does this tell you? It tells you that obviously the state does value the core of a person. It does value that your beliefs are in fact going to define you and how you act in society. If you can't get past that, then that's something that's obviously the state does not want. So we need to weigh the values, right? What do we actually want coming from our side? It's very simple. We think on our side, we strike a balance, on the sense that you get your retribution and you get your punishment at the same time. If you don't get the death penalty, you will still be in the prison, right? Obviously, it's not fun to be in prison. It's obviously not fun to be life sentenced in prison, right? So you're obviously still going to get your punishment. But on our side, we give you that option to not have that guilt on your conscience if you do not believe in the death penalty, right? We do not put that standard that says, aside from your family member being murdered, I also have the guilt on my conscience of another person being murdered. That's something that we do not want coming from their side. What we believe in is the value of people's decisions and the core of the people. We very gladly propose.
Right, thank you very much for that speech. We now invite the Speaker of Opposition, the Leader of Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, when you allow religion to be the ideal for which we tailor our policies, this is where you make it extremely arbitrary. We tell you that the state needs to be the moral bastion and set the standard, because people can't do it themselves. And this is something I will characterize a lot further in my speech. But before I continue, some rebuttals, right? 3 ideas. Number 1, firstly, on this idea of closure, right? Because they said it was very important that we do this for the closure of the victims. Look, if you are principally okay with doing this policy, you should be okay with principally extending it to other sentencing for other religions as well. In Islam, it's okay to stone women for being adulterous with their husbands. Why wouldn't you then do that? But secondly, we think closure comes at the expense of the closure that you get is hampered by your emotion. Of course, if you're a victim or you're the family member of a victim, you'd be intensely enraged that your family member or that you yourself were raped. We think we think because it's hampered by emotion, it hampers your rationality to make a balanced and a good judgment call, right? But thirdly, they said that they would only limit this to the death penalty, right? So if I get life imprisonment, if I am sentenced with life imprisonment, it doesn't count for me. So why are certain sentencing more important than others? We don't think they managed to clarify that, right? But second rebuttal on this idea of morality, because if morality is subjective, like they conceded to, right, the only determinant then should be the state. What happens here is that if I'm a murderer and I murder like all of these, if I murder like a little girl or something like that, right, I luck out and I'm able to dodge the bullet of capital punishment because the family of the girl I murdered is like super conservative and they don't want me to die because God says so. This is when, if like comparatively, you compare it to somebody who wasn't, who didn't hold on. If you compare it to a victim whose families didn't hold on to those beliefs, they would luck out and they would be able to dodge the system. We think this is extremely harmful. But secondly, if morality is so important because you can't function in the state, no, because this is what they said, then we don't think it's a problem because in status quo we allow you other methods to be able to have constructive discourse and to be able to like flesh out your morality in meaningful ways. We don't think this is limited. We don't think this is limited in any way. But third rebuttal on this idea of religion, because they said we need to do this because if not, these individuals will feel like they're going to hell if they don't veto it out. But look, you can still be principally against this idea of capital punishment, right? A lot of religions value your control. We'd like to think God wouldn't punish you for something that wasn't your fault. So yes, but even then, right, religion will never be the yardstick for us to tailor our policies to you. And they gave you the example of blood transfer refusal on part of the Jehovah's Witnesses, right? But the difference between blood transfusion and capital punishment is that it doesn't come at the expense of another person's life. We don't think that was a very relevant example. But yeah, okay, why not?
How's the lifetime in prison cells working out?
Because you don't die, a lot of people value their lives. We don't think that's a debate. We don't think that's a debate. Okay, 4 ideas, right? First idea on why religion in itself is a very subjective value to begin with. 3 layers. Number 1, states don't force you to opt into a religion. Therefore, we can see it's an optional thing that you can opt in or out of. So therefore, we can see that there's no objective benefit to religion to begin with, right? And in comparison to that, state law, which we set for you, is an objective benefit. Because if we set a state law for you that should apply for everybody, yeah, it is a subjective benefit in comparison to religion, which we don't force you to opt into in the first place. But secondly, religion is a self-tailored mechanism. Right? The Catholic Church doesn't support homosexuality, whereas a lot of other Christians do. It's not like a value that's objective in itself, but you take that religious value and you tailor it to yourself. So your personal interests are not acknowledged, right? The standards within your religion are ones that you place upon yourself. This is why like certain Christian store owners don't want to hire homosexuals to work for them because they don't believe that, yeah, they tailor to themselves and they don't believe that that individual should be working for them, right? But third layer, if religion is really the standard, then you would have to then extend it to other sentencing. This is where my example of stoning women because they cheat on their husbands in Islam applies. Courts cannot then be neutral because courts cannot then be neutral if you make that arbitrary standard the yardstick, right? And this is very, very problematic because law is always something that we have to make it extend to everybody, right? But second idea, and when has religion ever been able to supersede the state? We have 3 very good examples. Number 1, under Obamacare, where employers should provide contraceptives to employees if and when they so want to, right? Conservative people can oppose this if they want to, but in the instance that this law gets enough support that it becomes an actual piece of legislation, religious people can't then oppose it. They will have to do it because it's law. Second idea, this is why doctors cannot ethically opt out of operations, right? Because even if it's, when it's a dire situation, even if you object to it religiously, but you are the only doctor there, you have to be able to carry out that operation. We don't care about your religious preference. But thirdly, in America, even if you have a religious objection to killing people, you will still be conscripted into the army. We never like considered your religious preference in this case. But third idea, right? What is the importance of upholding law in status quo? Because we have to understand that law doesn't extend to just these victims, the families of these victims, but society as a whole. This is why we have jury systems, and this is why these jury systems comprise of individuals that are of different backgrounds, of different ethnicities, right? And secondly, that law is a very neutral arbiter to begin with. This is why we don't allow families of victims to be on that jury and make that decision in the court. even though at the end of the day, one person has been harmed or one person has been raped, the rest of society feels the brunt of that harm and rape and that social stigmatization of that one rape victim. You are harming everyone else within that society when you harm one person, right? But lastly, on this last idea of, do we already have the ability for constructive religious value to exist within discourse? Because while the law should never accommodate your religious objections within the law itself, we accommodate your ability to have religious discourse, right? If you have a religious preference or you want to change something with that law, you can lobby for it. You can make changes and you can spread awareness and things like that. But until the day you are able to do that successfully and are able to garner enough critical mass on the ground, the state has to draw a line that protects the collective good of society. What is the harm if you don't, right? You make religion a standard by which you can be vilified. So religion itself will get the stigma of a couple of people vetoing capital punishment. We don't think this is something that the state should ever support. For all of these reasons, I am very proud to oppose.
Right, thank you very much for that speech. We now invite the second speaker of the government. There you go.
We allow people to die for their religions. Why can't we allow a person to save a life for his religion? The justice system will fail that when we already killed a man, yet the victim of that man still feels guilty, still can't move on because he knows or she knows that the blood of that man is on his or her hands. That's where the justice system fails. That's when we cannot retribute and make victims move on. You have to understand that you have to be a more accommodating criminal justice system if we are going to function in society, if we are going to let justice be served. What am I going to tell you as a second affirmative speaker? I'm going to tell you how justice never allows for a conflict of interest. I'll tackle this on the idea on how people can obstruct justice just because it's against their religion. For example, they won't report a crime from happening because they know that they have no power to stop a death penalty from being sentenced onto their criminals. I'll talk about how it's actually our side that gives more leeway for victims to feel justice, and that's our side that gives more back to society. But before that, a couple of responses to the previous speaker. The first idea we'd like to tackle is this whole idea of, your religion is never a standard because, again, the state doesn't function on this whole religion idea, right? Firstly, that's already dismissive of the example, right? Let's bring back the example of Jehovah's Witnesses. Life is an essential right in the state. The state is against suicide. Yet when I deny blood transfusions, I'm basically killing myself. On that level, the state already allows religions to be determinant of state policies, already allows religion to be determinant of how I'm going to function in society. But secondly, we already told you that we're willing to forsake this value for something greater, for something bigger, and that idea is the idea of retribution. That's why we're okay with people's just using their moralities and just using their ethical values, not necessarily their religions. Like people who are atheists, who are incredibly against the death penalty, right? Second idea she brought to us was this whole example of conscription. Even if I am like someone who's against war, I have to be conscripted into the army to give back to society. Obviously, this person will still give back to society if he does not or she does not go to death row, because restitution is given when a person will spend 80 years of his life in prison. That's his way of giving back to society. Refer back to our model, right? If that person does not go to death row, that person still has to go to life imprisonment to serve his sentence to give back to society. So even on our side, we give back to society. But secondly, this is what we're going to tell you. The idea of restitution is equal on both sides, right? What's not equal and what's great on our side is the retribution, is the feeling you give to victims of these crimes, who they will know and they will sleep at night that the blood of that victim is not on their hands. Thirdly, on this idea of extensive criminal punishment, obviously we beg to differ. Killing someone with a lethal injection is obviously more humane than stoning a woman to death, right? Obviously, there is a difference, but again, there's another difference when you talk about death penalty and other petty crimes. Obviously, we cannot take back a life, but we can take back a sentence for robbery, we can take back a sentence for arson, but we can never bring back someone from the life. That's why we're talking about death penalty. That's the exclusive nuance, right? Why we can't just extend sentences, right? Now let's go on to this last issue she brought about, this whole stigma on religion. We think that stigma will still exist on their side. Why? Because even on their side, Christianity and other religions will still speak against capital punishment, right? They'll still get stigma stigma for speaking against the state. But secondly, there's even more stigma when you don't allow people to openly express their religions on something so crucial to them, on something so personal to them on that level, right? I'll take you later, right? Now let's go on to the substantives on how justice never allows for a conflict of interest, and I'll talk about the potential for obstruction, right? What's the idea we're trying to demonstrate, and what's the idea we're trying to contextualize in this debate? We're talking about the scenario where a victim is entrapped in a double tragedy, right? How does that tragedy take place? Firstly, if a person was raped, and even if that person would like to report that crime, that person would know that if I call the police, I'm basically sentencing a man to death, right? Why is this so important in this debate? That person is less inclined, or that person is less likely then to report the crime because he or she knows that if I call the police, it's a death sentence on that person. How is this likely, and why do we think this happens in society? So, we already got the characterization from a previous speaker that religions and moralities are so sacred, or so intrinsic to how people function in society, to how people live out their daily lives. That's why we think it's inherently possible for people to do that, and they actually do that in status quo, right? That's again an example of Jehovah's Witnesses. Even if I know that I'm going to get killed, I will do this for my religion. Even if I know that I can't report my rapist, I will do this for my religion. But there is a difference with our policy. I'll take you after this, right? So what is the benefit of our policy? We give victims more autonomy. That victim can then get his justice, but also feel good about himself, but also be able to move on and still stick to the principles of his religion because we gave him more autonomy. We gave him more autonomy that he was able to call the police, yet at the same time maintain his fundamental religious beliefs. That's where you get a more accommodating justice system, or that's when you get a more efficient justice system, when you talk about giving retributions to victims. Because why do we even punish criminals to begin with? We punish criminals on the idea of atonement, and the idea that they have to give back to their victims. What's giving back to their victims if victims will never sleep at night? If victims will never be able to continue their lives because they feel guilty for what they've done, because they feel guilty because they were powerless to stop the state? Go.
If morality is a very subjective value, you can see that why should we represent the collective morality of a law that's passed over one individual person anyway?
Ma'am, it's not the collective law. For example, if I'm a Catholic and I'd want that person to die, then I'd obviously vote against. Then I obviously wouldn't veto it. But if I was a Catholic who wouldn't want that person to die, then I wouldn't veto it to begin with, right? That's exactly on our side. We understand that some people function in a gray area, right? That's why it's on our side. Where, for example, if I didn't want that person to die now, but in 5 years I want him to die because I'm living in constant fear again, then our policy, then our model would still allow that. It's on your side that homogenizes people into the idea that everyone is okay with killing a man, that everyone is okay with sentencing a man to death, and we think that's not necessarily the case. Because what do we do? What do you want to do coming from our side? You want to empower the justice system and how they deal with cases. To understand that in the criminal justice system, everything is taken from a case-to-case basis. What we have to do in society now is to accommodate a greater majority of cases. What are the greater majority of cases we're talking about? We're talking about people who won't call the police because, supposedly, even if they want justice to be served, they will do it because, it's part of their religion. But secondly, we want to talk about the cases who will never move on because they'll feel guilty for killing a man, or they'll feel guilty for never being able to do about it. They have to present to us the explicit harm of our policy, right? Because all they done is bash on this idea of religion as a standard, when we already tell you that we can forsake that idea for something greater, for something that's more important than this debate. Why did we think that affirmative did win this debate, right? We think we won it because we were able to strike a balance to what the state should do to cater to people, because the state will not be omniscient, the state will not be omnipotent. That's why we have to give more power to the justice system. But secondly, it's on the idea of how we can give back to society, right? It's on this idea of how we can restitute and then retribute. For all those reasons and more, we're proud to propose.
Right. Thank you very much for the speech. Now I invite second speaker from the
Right. The right to end your life because of individual body autonomy does not come at the expense of society. Neither does it come at the expense of laws that have been approved or that have been voted for by a utilitarian calculus that society has. That is why, if you argue that morality is a subjective value, we need to uphold the morality of society. Something we think that is the most just system and the most fair that accommodates other individuals. I'm going to do for you two things in my speech. First of all, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about their standards and why we think it's a very arbitrary and discriminatory standard. But secondly, I'll talk to you about how we disincentivize people or religious individuals from actively participating in discourse or things that improve the legislature of the nation instead of vetoing it. But second of all, in the event where you homogenize or you say, as a Catholic, I wish to veto this, we think you push a lot of Catholics to fit within their standards. We think that's particularly problematic. Let's talk about a few rebuttals.
First of all, let's talk about the retribution of these victims. I have four rebuttals to this. Number one, you are setting the standard for closure, because in the event where it's not a death penalty that is given and it's a capital punishment, but I still principally believe that these men should not be rotting in jail for whatever reason that it may be, I will not be able to have a religious objection, because yours only allows religious objections to occur in the event where I got sentenced to a death penalty. So we think in all other circumstances that person will never get to religiously object. But second of all, you only allow one type of retribution. So on your side, retribution is diminished the moment the person feels it is religious obligation to stone that individual. Sit down. So we think your side accommodates only one side of the story. But third of all, we explain to you exclusively how these individuals are emotional, irrational, and these people are not within the framework to decide the circumstances. But fourth of all, we think that even if your side achieves retribution for some instance, we think society's retribution is more important. Because they say, well, it's the same. I put you in jail and I send you for the death penalty, it's exactly the same. We don't think so, Mr. Speaker, because we think when there are crimes as heinous as massacre, when they hurt individuals or they leech individuals, society wants to see this person dead. Because if the state draws that ethical line, Mr. Speaker, and society represents the ethical line, we need to stick with the ethical line. Sit down. But second of all, morality is subjective value and we need to represent the victims in status quo. What was their justification for this? They said, well, victims need to go on based on this idea of religion. We can see victims need to go on, but we don't think it comes at the expense of society, because we think it's a trade-off. You coming to terms with your religion is much easier than society coming to terms with religion being a barrier to laws being passed out. So we think that's the trade-off we're going to do. But second of all, we think these people will be able to come to closure, because Gina argued to you that you never had control of that situation. So you can still be principally against the state of the death penalty. You can lobby for, you can fulfill your religious obligation then. So we don't necessarily think these people will feel that their religion is failing them. But even then, in instances, in a lot of countries where your religion demands you to do jihad, we don't allow that. So we think retribution is never an absolute standard. Sit down. But last of all, he said, well, even Jehovah's Witness, where a state is principally against suicide, but you end your own life, that's still fine. But that doesn't come at the expense of another person. It doesn't come at the expense of society's version of a collective ideology. Because we explained to you, a crime is not an individual crime, it's against society. But what is his positive contribution? He said, well, reporting a crime will not necessarily happen. First of all, we don't think that's an exclusive thing that will exist on their side, because even if you do not report a crime, that doesn't tantamount to you actually perpetrating or not tantamount to you changing the law within the society. We think those are two different things. But even then, we think reporting of a crime is not an objective benefit, because we think that the sentencing or the law being passed is objective benefit. And third of all, we think that we can obviously understand this crime. We can send more police forces for all you care. We think that's not an objective benefit. But last of all, the victims' autonomy, because they say, well, these people will never be able to function in society, and these people will never be able to go back into the circumstances that they are. We are very happy to fund psychological therapy. We're very happy to have pastors come and tell you that you are part of a system that acknowledges a collective morality and you have to adhere to it. We think those are things we can do. We do it in prison rehab, where pastors tell you in prison that you're supposed to change for better. We think we can do the same thing for this thing. We don't think that exclusive. Yes, sir.
Debate and the motion, right? The idea of a veto is in a single criminal court case. Your own veto won't affect capital punishment in law, right? So I'm misunderstanding today. The veto won't affect capital punishment in law.
Guys, in the instance where even in one case you veto that in that particular capital punishment being given out, that means in principle you're agreeing that law is not something that we should uphold all the time. So we think in principle you are not following that law, and we think that can occur for multiple cases. You also have to defend the instance where if all people commit, or if all victims are religious, then that punishment wouldn't even exist to begin with. Debate that notion. We're going to talk to you about two things in my speech. Number one, let's talk about the idea of societal discourse and why the value of religion is a very subjective value. Because they completely dismissed my first speaker's argument about why religion is a subjective benefit. It's not a benefit that the state pushes onto you, but more importantly, it's not a benefit that necessarily has to come from religion per se. But second of all, they also argue to you why in conscription that you give back to society is the same way you do this. First of all, when we conscript you into war, you don't have your religious objection doesn't matter, because you're still going to have to carry out a function as a soldier. But second of all, giving back to society has to mean you have to uphold society's value. Because we think there's a difference between the capital punishment and the death penalty. Because the death penalty means that your life is ending. You don't wait for a natural course of action. Human intervention dictates it. So we think the natural course of things don't take place. We are taking a human stance against it. That's why society upholds them in certain instances. My arguments. First of all, let's talk about how you remove the merit of religion when your societal discourse gets shaped in an unfair manner. Because, first of all, you must understand, laws are a reflection of a society. A majority of you that went to parliament that voted for this particular instance is a general consensus. And within a liberal state or within a state that does have capital punishment, for example, in the United States, what it does mean is that the religious objection is not enough to outweigh the liberal consensus that existed within this country. But second of all, in the event where a lot of religious people or religious individuals want to discuss or want to lobby for a certain policy, they won't be able to do so. Or this is the type of discourse will be hampered because liberal or individuals who voted for this consensus, the general consensus, will feel like their laws are being mitigated by religion. Their laws are not being represented by the people on the ground, and religion is the standard. So we need to vilify religion to an extent where lobbying becomes hard to achieve because these people are not given credence. But second of all, you homogenize religion as the standard in which you adjudicate value. But third of all, you never incentivize these individuals to actually take up lobbying to begin with. Because we think there's a veto system, you will never have the objective incentive to persuade public, you will never have the incentive to essentially make it part of the law. Because we think if that law is so moral and it's so justified within status quo, society will represent it. If you as an individual based on your religion believe that it's something that is not within your calculus, we think it does not reflect society, we think laws need to be upheld for the collective morality of society.
Right, thanks very much for that speech. Now I invite the third speaker from the government.
If I were a conservative man who were to believe that allowing a man to die to capital punishment is akin to making me a murderer and will send me to hell, then in my singular court case, in my court case and in my court case only, then we think that we should give them the choice to choose what kind of retribution is best for them. If I were an atheist who believes that capital punishment is a good thing and will make me feel better, then we're allowing that choice as well. What they have to understand is that we're not taking away choice away from people, we're not forcing choice on people, but we're giving them the opportunity to choose their own choice. If I want it to happen, then we'll allow it. If I don't want it, then we will take it away from you. The idea on our side is that we're not forcing it on them, they will have the opportunity to use that veto. Firstly, let's look at this from the level of society, right? Here we're going to clean up the debate and clean up their stance. Secondly, let's look at this from the level of justice, from the idea of retribution and the idea of the obstruction of justice. But firstly, let's talk about society. Because they told us that society is going to degrade on how legislation works. They tell us that because of this, people aren't going to be able to get the kind of legislation they want because religion is going to be pushed onto them. This is where it became apparent that they misunderstood our proposal, right? We never said that when they veto it, they're going to veto the whole legalization of capital punishment. We never said that when they veto it, they're going to legalize anyone else getting capital punishment. They only veto that capital punishment happening in their own court case to the murderer who murdered their son. However, if the rest of society don't share the same view, if the rest of society don't share the same beliefs that that religious man shares, then perhaps that rest of society could choose not to use that veto option. It's that simple. If I have a different belief, then I also have the choice to undergo the capital punishment on my side, or thank you, on our side. Next, they told us that, well, religion can never be pushed onto you. Firstly, that's why atheists who believe that death penalty is a good thing on our side can also choose to have the death penalty be taken on. We're not pushing it upon them by saying, hey, you have to veto this. They can have their own choice whether or not they want to veto this or not. But secondly, even if religion can't be pushed onto you, we argue that the same right holds true for whether or not religion can be pulled away from people, for whether or not religion can be taken away from people and have their beliefs taken away from them when they force a sense of action on them. No, thank you. Then you're talking about a court case that can hold something as visceral as a murder, that can hold something as visceral as a rape, then retribution is of the utmost importance because we know that people who have been raped or people who have known someone to be murdered have been known to have that mental trauma stay with them for the rest of their lives. That's why retribution is such a big example. is such a big factor that we have to take in. So if that if this policy is something that takes away retribution away from you, then it's something that we're definitely going to take away. Next, let's look at the second idea, on the second issue, an idea of justice and idea of retribution. Coming from both the Labor opposition and the deputy, they told us that, well, capital punishment is a state's law, and therefore it should supersede religion. First level response. If you look at the roots of the state law, if you look at the spirit of that state law, then that state law only exists because it believes that using that capital punishment, that using that lethal injection allows people to self-actualize with retribution. That state law only exists because it believes that its own existence allows victims to achieve closure and move on away from the crime. No, thank you. That's why status quo right now can be self-defeating, right? Because if that state law is the exact same reason why you can't get closure, because that state law makes you feel like a murderer, then that state law is doing the opposite of its intention. No, thank you. That's why we don't think that we can keep on saying that this is the best retribution for you, that this is the best way for you to move on. Because individuals can be unique, individuals can hold different beliefs from the state, right? Even if we are the state law, we have to realize why we have that law in the first place. Holding that law true, no thank you, holding that law true only because the state law is frankly truistic. Next, they told us that, well, if you allow this, you should also allow the option for people to choose a public stoning. Firstly, that's a ludicrous example, right? Because here we're talking about a state that's okay with both capital punishment and life imprisonment, right? But no state out there is okay with stoning, except for maybe some extremist ones in the Middle East. On our side, you have both options offering the same amount of restitution, right? On our side, we still make sure, no thank you, that the prisoner gets commensurate punishment. How can we see this through? On both options, no matter whether or not it's vetoed, that prisoner will never go see the outside world, right? Because on our side, on both options, whether or not it's vetoed, that prisoner is eventually going to die in the arms of the state. Because we think that the punishment is commensurate on our side, whether or not it's a vetoed or not, we think that the only factor that we have to take in then, after that analysis, is the retribution of that criminal, is the retribution of that victim, right? So thank you. So given that we're mostly protecting the victim, we have to realize that we have to give the importance, the prominence there to the victim, given that we have the same amount of restitution on both options. Before I go on.
Sir, the same way that particular case, the state is not okay with the jury is not okay with giving that person life imprisonment. It's basically the same as the state not being okay with cruel law. So tell me why are the laws that you wouldn't defend cruel law anything?
You have to realize that whenever people say that this person deserves a death penalty, that's because the jury believes that if we don't give him the death penalty, then the retribution of the victim is never going to achieve the same amount of closure. As a jury, I would want to give someone a death penalty because I believe that this person has done something so immense and so heinous that if he goes to jail, the victim might not have the same level of restitution, the victim might not have the same level of closure. If the victim feels differently from the jury, then that's when the victim can choose to go against that call of the jury, right? Because the victim here is the biggest stakeholder that we're talking about. So if the jury tries to say something and oppose a level of retribution or a type of retribution on that victim, then it's something that we're definitely against. Lastly, we're going to point out the fact that they never even tried to respond to my deputy case, right? We told you how if I was a religious man and I become raped, or I know someone who gets murdered, I have less of an incentive to call the police and report that person. I have less of an incentive to help the police in finding my rapist because I know that if I get the rapist up to them, that rapist might go on and get the death penalty, right? And I wouldn't have any way to stop that on their side. This is bad because we don't think any conflict of interest should ever happen when you're giving away justice or dispensing justice for people who deserve it. For some people, making sure that they don't go to an eternity of hell is more important than making sure that their rapist goes to jail or gets a death penalty. That's why you can have that obstruction of justice on their side. That's why you have conflict of interest. We need a response coming from that. Mr. Speaker, we can't hold state laws up only because of the nature of them becoming state laws. We have to look at the spirit of the law. If it goes against retribution, we're definitely against it. I'm very proud to propose.
Thank you very much for the speech. We now invite the final people opposition.
We accept what Gov is doing, that victims do require closure, and that the law is retributive in where they can provide closure to victims when criminals are punished. But what do we not accept? That victims being able to choose and supersede the justice system based on an arbitrary standard like religion, or even an arbitrary standard of what they interpret ethics to be, of what they feel might give them the best form of closure. But that's even a contradiction on their side when they say nobody can find the truest form of closure. Exactly. That's why we think that the state and state values provide the most neutral arbiter of justice, and that's why they can accord the most proportional form of punishment to all of these criminals. Because the system caters to the rest of society. These criminals deserve retribution away from society. Why? Because they were a threat. Because the crimes, the heinous degree of their crimes, are undeserving of an arbitrary standard of religion or pity or whatever it is that these individuals feel. Because it's up to interpretation. That's why we need a very neutral arbiter as to what they deserve. Sit down. Now, what is the first issue of the case? Why can't we recognize subjective standards of religion of these victims? The biggest concession on their side is that if they principally agree to downgrading a punishment because they feel that's how they can get closure, because they are more comfortable with it, then they also principally agree to increasing the level of punishment that a victim can have, because people will have a different set of morals. If I don't care about what God says, or I don't care on any set of morals of what society tries to tell me, because I think I can get the best form of closure when I rip the rapist's head off, then why wouldn't you recognize that? Because that's the best way that I can get that closure. They don't recognize that because we think that we should accord a proportional form of punishment to those criminals. That's why the example of hudud law was brought up by my DPM, about why they wouldn't even recognize that if under their case, they're principally okay with recognizing downgrading the punishment. But why wouldn't we recognize that? Because the state needs to uphold a fair and proportional justice system. The punishment has to be in line with state values, because they are the arbiters of justice who can step out of the situation and decide what punishment is necessary for these criminals, of whether it really is proportional and not how much hurt the individuals have feel in itself. Because punishment is it's retributive, but it's also a deterrent to the rest of society. The contradiction that came up from their side was that nobody can claim this true closure of victims. So that's why the state at least does its very best in giving the most proportional form of justice, even when we told you that it sets a bad precedence in forming all of these other policies or in forming these laws on whether a victim should be able to decide. What do we try to prove from this clash? That there is no clear link from how recognizing these subjective standards can actually give an individual victim the closure that you're looking for. And that they don't draw any yardstick as to what a victim can feel. Because if I were to be raped, I would want to inflict more and more pain onto that victim. They've never drawn a yardstick as to when the criminal deserves the right form of punishment, or to why we even have the right to give them that punishment. But finally, that the state is the only arbiter that can step aside and give you the most neutral form of punishment. Before I go on to the next clash, sure.
If I'm an atheist and I get raped, I can choose not to veto the capital punishment, and I get the exact same thing I want. That rapist's head is also going to come up on my side. The Christian on the other side of the street, he might disagree, but that's why he has his own choice.
Sir, the problem doesn't exist on that side. The problem exists if I were an atheist and I feel that I'm not getting enough closure because I think the criminal needs even more pain. I need to inflict even more pain because of the amount of pain that I have felt. That's where the debate lies. It's about why these victims even deserve the right to inflict as much pain or as little pain as they want. That's why the state is the only one who can give that neutral arbiter. What's the difference between both our cases? Is that we offer the best system that can cater to everyone in society, because we recognize that the degree of the crimes of these criminals is incredibly heinous, and that it's a universal standard that the state should be able to uphold, so that they can set the standard that this is your crime, this is the punishment we accord to you, whether it's deserving of life imprisonment or whether it's deserving of death. That's why these laws are always set by the justice system, because people are very subjective and they'll want to inflict even more pain. But even then, the second level is that we allow the most neutral person to set the laws. So it's now a debate about state laws or state values versus these individual values, which is exactly what we fight for. But then, let's go into a clarification about what's the importance of individual court cases. Because now, when it comes to an individual court case, it shapes the policies of every individual who has their own idea of ethics if they choose to adjust the punishment. But on the second level, it even shapes the discourse of how we treat criminals, which is why it's important in how we, these court cases set the precedents for every other court case, or for how we even treat these criminals, and whether the discourse is necessary into the treatment of criminals by the state, or the ethics that we judge criminals by. But the second clash is the value of individual victims versus the values of individual victims versus the values of the state. Because the logic coming from their side is that they want to give victims better autonomy by maintaining their fundamental beliefs and catering to people in the gray area. If religion is so important to people who have these fundamental beliefs, then why don't we just set it as a standard? They were very dismissive in answering this. Because if it's a fundamental belief in me that I think that people who drink and take drugs need to be stoned, and it's something that makes me happier in how I live my life, then why wouldn't you set this as a standard? Even then, doctors who want to be able to opt out of procedures because of their religious beliefs, we don't set that as a standard because we think that there is a bigger harm to people undergoing those procedures or to people on the ground. That's why that's why we never prioritize individual values. These fundamental beliefs affect everyone else. That's why we need a system to provide neutral values that can best represent the benefit of everyone on the ground instead of those single people. So if I believe that a certain crime deserves a heavier punishment, I shouldn't be able to accord a criminal that, because I'm not in the best position to represent what I think everyone wants, even though there is no true form of closure.
Right, thank you very much for the speech. The final speech from the opposition team is by the opposition.
Right. The biggest problem with their side was they would never implement extremist versions of religion. Why do they say so? I'll analyze you why, and I'll tell you why it's a contradiction. Because they say the reason we wouldn't allow you to stone your person, because it isn't an option in court case, because it's either between the state's endorsed value of capital punishment or the state's endorsed value of life imprisonment. That already shows you they prioritize the state's value over religion that is not involved within a particular state law. It shows you that your options can only be involved within a particular state's legal system. It shows you that they already set the ethical standard as to what your option should or should not be. With regards to that, there are three questions in debate. Why shouldn't religion be a valid standard for objection? Second of all, which side actually accords some form of retribution? Because we think retribution is an absolute value. But third of all, how a law is made and which side actually accords the right of individuals based on law in essence. Number one, let's talk about religion being an actual valid standard of objection. Because the analysis to this is very simple. People get a benefit from religion and people believe in their lives are defined by it. That's why we need to allow it. Our first response is very simple. If that's the case, the same way we allow pastors to come in prisons to retribute individuals, we can also employ these individuals to help the victims come to terms with the implementation of state laws with regards to religion. But second of all, we also think that religion has never been a standard in which states say we would not accord the most neutral and moral system for society. That's why we in America, you don't have a right to be to pick and choose whether you want to go to war. We constrict you nonetheless. But second of all, if ethics is really your standard and you believe individuals have that right, they wouldn't up the system because their policy is very simple. Either stick to the punishment that the court gives you, in this case capital punishment, or you can downgrade it. So they never allow the ability of people to up the punishment. We never understood an analysis why. But third of all, if that's the case and religion is really the standard, we think that religion, all these objections can be put into constructive manner. That's why I argued in my speech about discourse, about lobbying and all these other constructive values that does not, number one, diminish the utilitarian law that came into place because a majority of individuals picked for it. But second of all, it allows that particular religious objection to be valued in this public sphere. We think they never engage with the values of these people being represented. their choice has to exist. We don't allow these people to, we allow these people political representation. We allow them to vote the same way we allow any other individual to vote. But in the event we are not part of the majority, we have to represent the majority. But second of all, which side can accord retribution? Because they said, well, retribution is never a perfect principle to begin with. That's why we think the same way we allow autonomy for individuals, like Jehovah's Witnesses, this was their only example, then we should allow that same autonomy to exist. The difference is this: you being a religious person does not come at the expense of another person. You being a Jehovah's Witness does not come at the expense of society's version of retribution. Does not come at the expense of a heinous criminal not being sentenced to that. Does not come at the expense of all these other things. So we think that's not an exclusive value in essence. But third of all, how are laws made and why should we uphold them? Because they say you are not catering to the true nature of law, which is nature of law, which is retribution. We are, Mr. Speaker. The very fact that a law came into place to begin with was because of a collective societal decision. So their side doesn't understand the true nature of law when you supersede that based on a certain portion of society. But what is their last value? We are not discriminating the state's entire law because of one individual case. This came out in whip. We think, first of all, I should explain to you how it sets a precedence for other cases. But second of all, it allows that standard to adjudicate one individual case. Even if it's only one case, Mr. Speaker, we think in principle you're superseding state's law, which allows individuals to not take discourse. This is where my argument came into place about how individuals are not taken into the merit of religious objection isn't taken into consideration in discourse, because the majority is being superseded by an individual who believes his religion is the ultimate standard. At the end of the day, this debate was about if your religion truly is the standard in which you want to accord these people rights, we'll allow you to do that constructively with the status quo. You also need to explain why a veto that only allows you to downgrade and no other standard that exists is the only way in which these people can get retribution.
Right, thank you very much for the final speech of this debate, and I invite a reply.
If a person feels happy that his rapist will die at the hands of a lethal injection, that happens on our side. If a rape victim will feel happy that his rapist was able to live, that will happen on our side. This is the model that was always misclashed by opposition bench, right? Because all they did was nitpick at certain points of our policy, but never really tell us whether our policy was better, never really holistically engage us in our argumentation. This is what I'll try to prove to you coming as a biased adjudicator for affirmative bench, right? I'll have two reply issues. The first one would be the necessity of the policy, because this is where most argumentations, this is where most constructives and responses were exchanged. And secondly, on the scope of benefits rights, because both sides were talking about a lot of trade-offs, or which rights do we value, on which states' values do we actually uphold. Let's tackle the first one, the necessity of the policy. What did we tell you coming from our side? The current justice system is ineffective in giving people closure, so we will allow people to make choices in their own single court cases, right? What was the misclash we got from opposition bench? We got up arguments that said that single court cases can repeal the capital punishment law and will actually make capital punishment illegal, right? This whole idea of court precedents. Why were we able to debunk this with our responses, essentially? What were the arguments that we were able to debunk when we actually provided your model? You already debunked their argument that it was society's consensus to form the law. You already debunked the argument that it stigmatizes religions because they work to repeal the law. Because we don't work to repeal the law when it comes to capital punishment. You only aim to give more autonomy for single criminal court cases, right? Never did we get a response coming from all three speakers of negative when it came to how there's obstruction of justice on their side. When victims don't report crimes because the rapists or the murderers can get sentenced to death. What were the other arguments we got from opposition on this issue, right? We got these arguments that religion shouldn't take place as a standard because no one can dictate a single form of closure. That was conceding to our value. Given that no one can dictate a value of closure, something that they mentioned, something that they conceded to, it would be highly unfair to place a blanket policy that everyone must die, that everyone must face death penalty, that there is no other option. They already conceded to our value that no one can arbitrate what closure means. Therefore, we have to give more autonomy on singular court cases. Therefore, we have to give more autonomy on singular victims. But then we got the response, right? But why does it have to be religion, right? Because we don't necessarily arbitrarily arbitrated that. We told you that it has to be religion because it functions in how inherent it is, and how important it is to a person's personality, to how a person's well-being, and how he functions in daily life. Let's go on to the second reply issue, right? The scope of benefits. What were the benefits or what were the trade-offs they presented to use? They told us that we have to give back to society, and this is where they use the example of conscription, right? How did we debunk this whole benefit, right? We told you that it's the same thing, right? Life imprisonment, spending your 80 years in your life if you are not killed, is the same as giving back to society when you are killed. I'm pretty sure that dying and spending 80 years of your life in a cell give the same form of restitution to society. But secondly, we asked the question, where is the state more liable? Is the state liable to people who didn't have anything to do with the rape case, or is the state liable to the actual rape victim when you talk about giving back to society? This is where we have to draw the line. That's a question they never told us. But then this is the response we got from the whip and the deputy of negative, right? We need to allow the most mutual arbiter, which is the state, and you cannot supersede state law. What we told you was that the state is not omniscient, the state does not know everything, the state cannot go into the minds of victims and tell them they are all right. Therefore, we have to give more autonomy to the criminal justice system. But secondly, this is where we have to question the existence of state laws if they're counterintuitive, if they defeat their own purpose, because you're not looking at the spirit of the law, you're not looking to why these laws were created in the first place. These laws were created to make victims feel protected, to make sure that justice is served. If these laws don't work, then obviously we need to implement a new policy, and that policy is government's model. When you give the justice system more autonomy, when you make sure that obstruction of justice doesn't happen, and you make sure that you're able to serve society better when you talk about giving people more justice. For all those reasons and more, we're proud to propose.
Thank you very much, and thank all speakers. While you cross the law at the end.